Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. On today's tutorial, I'll be sharing with you how to make a corset jumpsuit with Flounce. So if it's your first time viewing my channel, please hit on the subscribe button and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. And if you're a returning subscriber, thank you for supporting my channel. So let's start. So I've gone ahead to mark all my vertical measurements, which is my shoulder to bust, shoulder to under bust, and shoulder to waistline. And I went ahead to mark the standard neckline, which is 3 by 3 inches. So after that, what I'm going to do next is to mark my shoulder. So I'm going to mark the shoulder divided by 2, and because I'm attaching a sleeve to the dress, I'll be marking ½ inch for joining of the sleeve. So I'm adding this ½ inch because we are going to attach sleeve to the dress. So from there, I'm going to come down by 1 inch, which is my shoulder slope or my shoulder slant, and I'm going to connect it back to my pattern. I'll connect it back to the neckline of my pattern. So after I'm done doing this, the next step is to get your chest line, and your chest line, to get that, is your bust circumference divided by 6 plus 1.5 inches. So I'm going to go ahead to mark. So what I have is 7.5, and I will make a dot at that point. So from that 7.5, I'm going to place my ruler and I'm going to draw a straight line to that point. After drawing that line, I'm going to place my ruler and I'm going to go ahead to also draw a straight line at this point also. Now it's time to draw my armhole curve. So I'm going to place my tape and I'll fold it into 2 to get the center. And from there, I'm going to go in by ½ inch and I'm going to connect it to my chest line. But before I do that, I'm going to place my bust circumference and working width divided by 4 on that point. So from there, I'll go ahead to place my French curve and I'm going to draw my armhole curve. So after doing that, I'm going to place it upwards and I'll connect to the shoulder line. And after connecting, I'm going to go ahead to use a marker to outline it properly. After outlining, I'll go ahead to outline other parts of the pattern also. So next is to mark my dart intake. To mark that, I'm going to mark my nipple to nipple divided by 2, the nipple to nipple I'm working with on the chest line, on the bust line, at the under bust, and down to the waistline, and I will be extending it to the basque length. So I'll go ahead and place my ruler and I will draw a straight line connecting all those dots. So next, I'll be marking 1 inch dart intake on both sides of this line. So for a plus size person, you can go ahead and mark 1.5 inches. So I'm going to mark this starting from my under bust to the waistline, and after that, I'm going to go ahead to connect the line. So next, I'm going to place my French curve connecting my under bust to my bust line. So if you don't have a French curve, you can go ahead to use a freehand sketch. So I'm going to repeat this on both sides of my pattern also, connecting from the under bust, down to the bust line. So this is what I have. On the center part, you can decide to come down by half, but I'm still going to maintain the chest line and I'll go in by half. So from there, I'm going to go ahead, place my French curve, and I'm going to connect it down to my under bust. So I'll go ahead to outline it to make it more visible. So after outlining it, so I'll go ahead to extend the line I have at the chest line by 2 inches upwards. So you can go ahead and use 1.5, but I want it to cover the bust very well. So after doing that, I'm going to still mark my 1 inch dart intake on both sides, and I'm going to go ahead and place, and I will connect back to my bust line. So when you're doing this, make sure you don't really have a very slanty line, because it might be too difficult or it won't give you exactly the shape you want. So after doing this, next is to connect the upper part of this. So whatever shape you have on this will determine the shape you have on your cup. So I'll go ahead to outline what I have on this part so that it will be very visible for you to see. Next, I'll be connecting this part to the other part of the corset to form the yoke of this corset pattern. So before I draw the curve for the other side, whatever I have at this point, I'm going to divide it into two and I will mark. So from that point, you can decide to go down by ½ inch or you can just draw it on that point. So I'm just going to place my French curve and I'm going to connect it to that point. So from the sides, I'm going to take it down to my under bust and I'm going to place my French curve this way. If you don't have a French curve, you can go ahead to use a freehand sketch. So after drawing it out, I'm just going to use my marker and I'm going to connect my curve. So my cup and the yoke part of this corset is ready. So this is what I have. So I'll go ahead to label this yoke and I'll label this one and I'll label these two also. So next is to insert my body circumference. I'm going to mark my bust circumference divided by 4. Then go ahead to mark the dart intake I have and I'll replace it and I'll add my sewing allowance to it. So after that, I'll go down to the under bust, but before I do that, I'll outline my lines very well. I'll go down to the under bust and I'm going to mark whatever I have at the under bust divided by 4. I'm going to go ahead to mark. After marking that, I'm going to measure the dart intake, 2 inches dart intake. I'll replace it, add my sewing allowance. At the waistline, I'm going to mark my waist circumference divided by 4 and I'm going to mark. After marking that, I'm going to replace the 2 inches dart intake and I'm going to mark and go ahead and add my sewing allowance. So whatever I have there, I'll just take it down because that corset is not getting to the hip point. Then I'll extend what I have from the bust to the chest line, take it to the under bust and take it back to the waistline. So what I will do next is to go ahead to outline all my pattern. After outlining it, I'll go ahead to label it as C1 meaning center one and S1 meaning side one, and then I'll go ahead to cut out my pattern. So at this point, if you find this tutorial very interesting and educative, please hit on the subscribe button. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and leave your comment at the comment section. So right now we're going to the back. I've gone ahead to mark all my vertical measurements just like we did in the front, and I marked my zipper. So I'm going to mark out my chest line. That will be serving as my yoke area. So the person I'm making this dress doesn't want a lacing bar. That's the only difference. If you want to make a lacing bar, you're just going to place your tip, mark 2 inches after the zipper line and create your lacing bar. But there's no much difference from the yoke and every other part of this corset. So after that, I'm going to mark my dart intake and I'm going to mark my nipple to nipple divided by 2, and whatever measurement I'm taking is going to start from the zipper line. So after marking that, I'm going to go ahead and place my tape at the shoulder and I'm going to mark my bust, my shoulder to bust plus 1 inch. So that is where my dart will start, and from here I'm going to go ahead to mark my nipple to nipple divided by 2. I'm going to mark it at the under bust line, at the waistline, and down to my waistline. So after doing that, I'm just going to go ahead to outline the line at the waistline to show that the back pattern ends at the waistline. There's no basque at the back. So I'll go ahead to connect all those lines. So after that, I'm going to be taking ½ inch dart intake at both sides of the back and I'm going to connect it to that point I marked my shoulder to bust plus 1 inch at both sides. So after doing this, the dart intake for the back is complete. So I'm going to take my body circumference. I'll mark my bust circumference divided by 4 and mark my sewing allowance. So after marking that, at the waist at the under bust, I'm going to mark my under bust circumference divided by 4. Then I'll mark my sewing allowance. After marking my sewing allowance, I'm going to measure this dart and I will replace it. So whatever measurement you're taking is going to start from the zipper line. So I'll go down to my waist and I'm going to mark the waist circumference divided by 4, and I'm going to go ahead to measure and I will replace it, mark the dart intake and mark my sewing allowance. So after doing that, I'll connect from the bust down to the chest line, and I'll connect from the bust down to the under bust, and from the under bust I'm going to connect back to the waistline of my pattern. Now at the yoke part of my back, I'm going to go ahead and mark 1 inch at this point. So from that point, I'm just going to connect it down to where my dart ends. So I'll just go ahead to trace out that line this way. If you have a French curve, you can also make use of that. So to get rid of the bulginess at the back of the dress, I'm going to go ahead to mark 1/2 inch and I'm going to extend it upwards to the chest line. So what I'm going to do is to cut out that part. So I'll label this as yoke. So I'll go ahead and continue cutting out my pattern. So while cutting, I'm going to go ahead to chop off this part that is going towards the zipper part, because I'll be putting a loop there. So I don't want to cut out my dart, so I'll just go ahead to blend it in, and so my back pattern is ready. Moving over to the trouser part of the jumpsuit. So how to fold your material is your lap divided by 2 plus 2 inches, or you can do your lap divided by 2 plus 3 inches. So right now, the first thing I'm going to mark is my crotch line. So to mark your crotch is your hip divided by 4, or you're going to go ahead to sit down and measure it. So most times I prefer sitting down to measure it, because you just get the maximum measurements for your crotch or crotch. So I'm just going to mark the crotch, and most times after getting my crotch, I usually add 1 inch to my crotch to avoid it being too tight. So next is to mark your front crotch extension, and to get that is your hip divided by 4. So whatever you have, you still divide it by 4. Let's say your hip is 40, divided by 4 you have 10, then divided by 4 again you have 2.5. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that. So after marking that, I'm just going to go ahead to connect it from the top to the point of my crotch. So next I'm going to place my tape and mark the hip point. So the hip point I'm using is 8 inches. So after marking my hip point, I'm just going to extend my crotch line. So the next step is to mark your waist to knee point. So after marking my waist to knee point, I'm going to mark my full trouser length. So after marking my full trouser length, I'm just going to add 2 inches for folding allowance at the lower part. I'll just write there as knee, and here as my hip, and here as my crotch. For my crotch curve, I'm going to go up by 2 inches from my crotch line, and I'm going to draw a curve from my crotch. So this is what I have at this point. And to insert my measurements, so sorry, when I was recording, my phone went off. I didn't know that my camera went off. So I'm going to be doing an explanation of how I did the marking. So what I did was to mark my waist circumference at the waist point, and I added 1 inch allowance. At the hip point, I marked my hip circumference divided by 4 plus 1. And at my crotch, that's where I marked my lap measurement, and I added 1 inch, and I started in front of my crotch to mark my lap measurement. So after that, going down to the knee, I went in by 1.5 inch and I inserted my knee round plus 1 inch allowance and whatever I had on my knee, I extended it down to the lower part because the trouser is kind of free on the lower part. It's more like a palazzo trouser. So if you don't understand this, I'm still going to do a video on how to draft a trouser. I have a requested video on how to draft a palazzo, so I will be explaining it more on that. So afterwards, I went ahead to cut it out and I placed it on another fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be adding 2 inches in front. So right, if you watched my video of how to draft a cargo pant, is slightly different from this. So after marking that 2 inches, I'm going to go ahead to mark 2 inches also at the lower part of this trouser. So for my cargo pants, I just marked 1.5 inches at the knee point and 1 inch, but this particular pattern I'm using 2 inches. So I'm just going to mark that 2 inches from the beginning to the end of my pattern. After marking this, I'll go ahead to trace exactly what I have at my back. So by the time I take in 1 inch that on both sides, and I'm going to use 1 inch to shape the center, and at the side of the trouser the waistline is going to align. So I'll go ahead to trace out the back of the trouser, and with that we are done with the lower parts. So at this point, if you find this tutorial very interesting and educative, please hit on the subscribe button. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and join us in our next video. So now I have 2 pieces for my front and 2 pieces for the back. So in our next video we'll be joining the pattern, so do well to join us.